You know, there's this really comforting idea that classical music is somehow fixed,
Yeah.
carved in marble.
Right.
You go to a concert, you open the program, and it says, Bach, Orchestral Suite Number 3, and you just assume that's it. That's exactly what he wrote, what he called it.
It's a very stabilizing thought, isn't it?
Yeah.
That there's a definitive version of these masterpieces just sitting in a vault somewhere.
Yeah.
But when it comes to Johann Sebastian Bach, and specifically these famous orchestral suites, that marble is actually, well, it's more like wet clay.
That is exactly what we're unpacking today. We're looking at 4 of the most famous works in the Baroque repertoire. I mean, we're talking about music that includes the air on the G string and the battery.
Household names, really?
And we're going to find out that almost everything we think we know about them might just be wrong.
Oh, absolutely. Wrong names, quite possibly the wrong instruments, and in some cases, entirely different purposes than what we hear today.
So for this deep dive, we've got a stack of research here. We're talking manuscript analysis from scholars like Joshua Rifkin, historical context, all of it. We're going to peel back those layers.
And I think the very first layer we have to chip away at is the name itself.
Okay.
Because if you had walked up to Bach in Leipzig, say around 1730, and asked to hear his orchestral suite, he probably would have just looked at you with total confusion.
He didn't use the word suite at all.
No, not for these.
Yeah.
In the manuscripts, Bach labeled these works as ouvertures.
Which is confusing for a modern listener, because when I think overture, I think of, the intro to an opera, the curtain raiser.
Exactly. And that's one meaning. But in Baroque Germany, the word had this kind of dual meaning. It was almost like a part that stands for the whole.
So how does one movement end up being the name for the whole collection?
Well, the first movement of all these pieces was in a very specific style called a French overture. It has a really rigid form. It always starts with a slow, majestic section, lots of dotted rhythms. You know that sound. It's very jagged and regal.
Right, very precise, almost jerky.
Yes. Then it just bursts into this fast fugal section where all the instruments are kind of chasing each other. And then finally it comes back to that slow majesty at the end.
So that first huge movement is the ouverture.
Right. But because that opening movement was so massive, I mean, it's usually the longest and most complex piece by far, the Germans just started calling the entire collection of dances that followed it an ouverture as well.
Huh, so it's like calling an entire album track 1 just because the first song is 10 minutes long.
That's a great way to put it. It was shorthand, really.
Yeah.
It signaled to the audience this is a big collection of dances in the prestigious French style.
And that French label is a big deal at the time.
Oh, huge. French culture was the absolute height of sophistication in Germany. If you were writing music in the French style, you were signaling that you were cosmopolitan, that you were elite.
So Bach was being trendy.
He was definitely tapping into a very popular genre. But here's the thing that really jumped out at me from the research. We only have 4 of these from Bach. Just 4.
That feels surprisingly low. We always think of Bach as this machine who wrote a cantata every week for years.
He was prolific, for sure. But in this specific genre, he's a statistical anomaly. I mean, look at his contemporary, Georg Philipp Telemann.
Who was arguably more famous than Bach back then.
Absolutely. And Telemann left us about 135 of these suites.
135.
And scholars think he wrote vastly more that have been lost. Christoph Graupner left 85. Johann Friedrich Foch left nearly 100. So Bach's 4. They're rare birds.
Do we have any idea why? Was he just not that into them?
Well, Bach was almost always writing for a specific job. He wrote church music for the church, keyboard music for teaching. These suites likely didn't fit his day-to-day work as neatly as they did for someone like Telemann, who was running public concerts.
So they weren't written as a set then?
Right.
That's a big misconception, isn't it? We buy the CD, the orchestral suites, and assume he wrote them 1 through 4, like he did with the Brandenburg Concerto.
Exactly. But the Brandenburgs were a single collection, basically a job application. These 4 suites are from completely different years, roughly 1724 to 1731. Different instruments, probably for different groups. We just lump them together because, it's convenient for a recording.
Okay, so let's zoom in on the most famous one, Suite Number 3 in D major. This is the big one. Trumpets, drums. It's got that huge celebratory energy.
And, of course, it contains the second movement that literally everyone on the planet knows.
The air.
The air on the G string.
Right. And this is a classic deep dive fact, but it's so important. Bach never, ever called it that.
No, that title is a ghost from the future. It comes from the late 19th century, well over 100 years after Bach died. A German violinist named August Wilhelm decided to arrange the movement.
And just to show off, he transposed it down a step so he could play the entire melody on just one string of the violin.
The lowest string, the G string. It gives it this incredibly rich, throaty, romantic sound.
Yeah.
And that remix, if you want to call it that, became so famous it totally eclipsed the original.
It's wild because in Bach's version, the melody is woven into the first violins. It's much lighter, it floats.
It's far more transparent. But, there's actually a bigger controversy with Suite Number 3 than just the name of the slow movement.
This is where we get into the heavy scholarship.
This is where we get into Joshua Rifkin's theory.
Right.
So Rifkin is a brilliant and sometimes controversial musicologist. And he looked at the original sources for Suite Number 3 and noticed something odd. The physical paper, the parts from the 1730s, they're a patchwork.
A patchwork? How?
Well, you have some parts that are in Bach's own handwriting, specifically the first violin and the continuo.
And the continuo is the bass line, right? Cello and harpsichord, usually.
Exactly, the rhythm section. So Bach wrote those parts himself. But then the trumpet, the timpani, and the oboe parts, they were copied out by his son, C.P.E. Bach. And the other string parts were copied by a student.
Okay. So what does that suggest?
Rifkin argues that this separation means the piece wasn't originally for a full orchestra at all.
So what was it then?
He thinks the original version was for strings only. No trumpets, no drums.
That completely changes the feeling of the piece. We think of number 3 as this pompous military entrance of the king kind of music.
And Rifkin is saying that entire layer might just be an afterthought. That Bach took an existing string piece and just dressed it up later for a special occasion. If you strip it back, it becomes much more intimate.
It's like finding out a heavy metal song started its life as an acoustic ballad.
That is a perfect analogy. And we see this pattern of retrofitting music even more clearly in the other D major suite, number 4.
The other big one with the trumpets.
Yes. And in this case, the evidence for him recycling the music is undeniable. Bach actually took the first movement of Suite Number 4 and turned it into the opening chorus of Christmas cantata.
Cantata 110, Unser Mund sei voll lachens.
Our mouths be full of laughter.
A fitting text for Christmas.
It's incredibly joyous. And to match that text, Bach added a full choir, trumpets, and drums. So Rifkin argues that the orchestral suite version we know today might actually be what we'd call a backport. Bach liked the Christmas version so much, he decided to update the instrumental suite to match it.
So the original might have been strings, then he makes the cantata with drums, and then he goes back and adds the drums to the suite.
Very likely.
Yeah.
And it just shows that for Bach, a piece of music wasn't some finished monument. It was functional material. You could expand it, contract, or repaint it depending on the occasion.
Which brings us to the biggest mystery of all. Suite number 2 in B minor.
Ah, the flute suite.
Or so we think. This is the one that ends with the Badineri.
Which, I should say, for any of our listeners in the UK, might trigger some deep-seated nostalgia.
Right.
It was the theme music for ITV School's morning programs in the 80s and 90s. Instantly recognizable.
Nothing says Baroque masterpiece like waiting for a science documentary to start in middle school, but the Badineri is famous for being a flute showpiece. It's incredibly fast.
It is. The word itself means jesting or joking. It's a sprint.
But here's the twist. There's a very strong school of thought that says this music was not written for the flute at all.
This is one of my favorite debates in all of musicology. It's like musical forensics.
Okay, lay it out for us.
The manuscript we have is from around 1738. But there are clues on the page, literal graphical clues, that suggest Bach was copying from an older document.
And the smoking gun is a typo?
A typo, or maybe a correction. On the title page, where Bach writes the word traversier, which means transverse flute, it looks suspiciously like he wrote the letter T over an existing letter V.
V4, violin.
That's the theory. That he started to write violino, realized he was making a flute version this time, and corrected himself.
Okay, but a typo is one thing. Is there any actual musical evidence?
There is. A lot of it. First, the key. The suite is in B minor, which is a bit awkward for a Baroque flute, but if you transpose it down to A minor, it fits the violin perfectly. And more importantly, there are techniques in the music that just scream violin.
You're talking about bariolage.
Exactly. Bariolage is a French term for a bowing technique, where you rapidly alternate between a static note on an open string and a moving melody on another string.
Mm.
For a violinist, it's a very natural rocking motion.
Like patting your head and rubbing your stomach, but with a bow?
Yes. And on a violin, it sounds brilliant because that open string rings out with a lot of resonance.
Yeah.
On a flute, it's incredibly awkward. You have to jump these wide intervals with your breath, and it sounds breathless, not resonant.
So Rifkin's theory is that this was originally a lost violin concerto in A minor.
That's the leading theory, yes.
Yeah.
But the plot thickens. Because another musician, the brilliant oboist, Gonzalo X. Ruiz, has looked at all the same evidence and said, I don't think it's violin either. I think it's oboe.
Oboe? Why oboe?
Ruiz points out the range. If this were a violin piece, you would absolutely expect the soloist to use the G string, the lowest, richest string. But the music, it curiously avoids that entire low register.
I see.
It stays in a range that perfectly matches the Baroque oboe. And Ruiz argues that the figuration, the specific shape of the fast notes, looks exactly like the writing in Bach's other oboe works.
This is amazing. So when we hear a flautist struggling through the botanary, we might be watching them play a translation of a translation.
And yet, it works. That's the genius of it. Even if it was originally for violin or oboe, the flute version is spectacular. It has this fragile, breathless quality that really suits that jesting character.
There is a middle ground here, too, isn't there? The flautist Stephen Zahn has an idea.
Right, he's the diplomat in this argument. He suggests that the original A minor version might have been generic enough to be played by either a violin or a flute from the very beginning, a sort of choose-your-own-adventure solo part.
We've covered suites 2, 3, and 4. What about number 1 in C major? Is it just as controversial?
It's actually the most stable of the bunch. It's scored for woodwinds and strings, no trumpets, and it feels the most authentically French. It's like a sampler platter of French dances. You get a fourlaine, a javotte, a passe-pie.
So it's the most straightforward.
If you want to know what this ouverture genre was supposed to sound like to a German audience in the 1720s, I'd say start with number 1.
But even if the original is stable, the life of these pieces after Bach died was anything but. We mentioned Wilhelm Schur and his air on the G string, but it wasn't just him.
No, not at all. The Romantics loved this music, but they felt the orchestration was too thin for their huge concert halls. Gustav Mahler, of all people, arranged suites 2 and 3.
Mahler editing Bach. That feels a bit sacrilegious to modern ears.
To us, maybe. But to him, he was bringing Bach into the modern age. He even combined movements from the different suites to create a new supersuite. And here's my favorite image. When Mahler toured with the New York Philharmonic, he would conduct these arrangements from the keyboard.
Mahler on a harpsichord.
Yes. But in true Mahler fashion, he reportedly played the continuo part with such ferocity that he was basically conducting the entire orchestra with his chords.
Wow. And then you have composers like Giuseppe Martucci in Italy turning them into solo piano pieces.
Which just proves the durability of the musical ideas, right? You can play them with a massive Mahler orchestra, strip them down to a single piano, play the flute part on an oboe. The core logic of the music holds up.
It really challenges this modern idea of the definitive recording.
Completely. We're obsessed with authenticity today. We want to hear exactly what Bach heard. But what this deep dive really shows is that even Bach didn't just hear one thing. He heard strings, then he heard trumpets. He heard a violin, then he heard a flute. The music was alive.
It's like these manuscripts are just snapshots of a moving target.
That's a beautiful way to put it. They're freeze frames of a process.
So here's a thought to leave you with. We revere these 4 suites as these great pillars of the orchestral repertoire. But if Bach was an outlier who only wrote 4 while Telemann was writing over 100, and if the most famous flute solo might have been for a violin, and the most famous orchestral air was originally for a chamber group,
then you have to ask yourself,
yeah,
are we loving Bach, or are we loving the specific accidents of history that allowed these particular versions to survive on paper?
If a fire had happened in a different library in 1750, our entire concept of the perfect orchestral suite could be completely different.
It almost certainly would be.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. Go listen to the suites again and see if you can hear the ghost of the violin in that flute solo.
Enjoy the music.